So I've been playing Dirge of Cerberus. You know, quite a while ago I actually made a video about this game before. It's called Dirge of Cerberus is Silly. The main point of that video was to express the conflicting opinions I had. Thing is, the way how I felt about it was that I kinda wanted to like the game, but that there were too many things wrong with the game that prevented that from happening. But even then, I never really thought that the game was terrible or anything like that. It's just that it felt really lazy and unimaginative to me. Or at least it did at the time. So I figured that I might as well give it a proper review now. Because, well, I don't know. Anyway, despite this game carrying the Final Fantasy name, it isn't a JRPG. It is in fact a third-person shooter with some mild RPG and survival horror elements here and there. So you repeatedly shoot things in the face, level up, upgrade your weapons, and solve the occasional puzzle here and there. Really, I wouldn't have been surprised if Square's executives looked at the success of Resi 4 and just said, "That! Make that!" Which is strange, cause every little bit of info I could find says that they were inspired by Devil May Cry. But despite both Vincent and Dante having a fetish for the color red, I don't see any resemblance on the gameplay side. That's cause the game's producer Yoshinori Kitase was inspired by first-person shooters. So, you know, they made a third-person shooter. Anyway, the game's story takes place 3 years after the events of Final Fantasy VII, and follows the tale of Vincent Valentine, an optional character from Final Fantasy VII who was chosen to be this game's protagonist simply because he's the king of Edge. Seriously, this guy even gives Shadow and Dante a run for their money. Also, Vincent has a lot of unexplained backstory, so I guess that would make him a good choice too. I guess. Anyway, a big bad evil company called Shinra, who were the big evil baddies in the first game, have some failed experiments locked away deep underground called Deep Ground. Now, these Deep Ground guys have managed to escape, and instead of talking about it like nice, reasonable adults, they decide to kill some people. Also, they seem to be after Vincent because he has this thing inside him called the Proto-Materia, which is used to control chaos. Which is really just a trigger for this big old end-of-the-world sequence. And, you know, they're evil and stuff, so they want to do that. Now, of course, Square manages to call upon the gods of retconning to make it so that all of this Proto-Materia stuff ties into Vincent's past as a lab specimen. And despite me sounding like I'm taking the piss, I do actually kinda like the plot. Partially because I just really like Final Fantasy VII, but also because I find it kind of fascinating to see a team of fairly competent writers desperately struggle to somehow make this shit work. The story is pretty far with its head up its own ass, and they didn't bring nearly enough lube to make it even remotely comfortable. Thing is, the game takes itself way too seriously, instead of it just embracing how ridiculous it actually is. I mean, the game does get a little silly when the cape-wearing Scottish cat is talking to the BDSM goth in the nuclear reactor. Anyway, like I said, it's a third-person shooter with some mild RPG elements here and there. And for what it is, they actually do have some pretty cool ideas. It's just kind of a shame that it doesn't quite turn out as well as it possibly could have. I mean, despite previous attempts, Square clearly just isn't very good at making action games. They've gotten better over time, and it's not like they're terrible at it either, but I feel like this game would have fared a lot better if they would have had a third party handle the gameplay. Just like Kojima decided to give Rising to Platinum, Square probably would have been better off doing something similar. Of course, that kind of effort and planning doesn't quite work with Square's "grab the money and run" mentality they've developed over the last 10 years. Either way, I'll try and explain why I think the gameplay isn't as good as it probably should have been. First off, doing things like selecting items and weapons while fighting is really clunky, to say the least. I mean, you scroll through items with the left arrow, but you use them with the right arrow. So you can only scroll one way, which isn't only annoying when you quickly need to use something, but it also goes against all of my gamer instincts. The same goes for cycling through weapons with L2 and reloading with R2. Quite often I found myself reloading and using items on accident. The latter being especially annoying since you can only carry a very limited amount of items. Which isn't only annoying because you run out way too easy, but also because they shower you with so many items that I often found myself using a potion just so I could pick up the ones laying around. And I know that sounds like I'm contradicting myself, but it is really just a strange issue I have with the game. Like I said, you can only carry a limited amount of potions, and healing up completely usually makes you burn through all of them in one go. So because of that, I found myself taking way too many pit stops at the local jukebox to stock up on items. I mean, you get showered with cash anyway, so you might as well. But at the same time, all enemies drop items as well, which could have made it so that the jukeboxes wouldn't have been necessary in the first place. But with the way they structured the game, there's usually a jukebox right before every big firefight and right after. But all the random cannon fodder enemies in between the big firefights drop items as well. So in between big fights you get showered with items you don't need, and during those fights you usually burn through all of them within minutes. And while I do think my playstyle is partially to blame for this as well, I still feel like they probably could have done a better job with the jukebox and enemy placement. Cause as it is right now, it just seems to me like they weren't sure whether they wanted to make the game challenging or just piss easy. Now, something that isn't actually half bad is the game's shooting, which is good considering that that's what you'll be doing more than half of the time. Thing is, the game actually uses triggers in a natural way, and it also has an aim assist which makes up for a lot of the awkwardness that is aiming with analog sticks. Either way, it's pretty easy to shoot guys, and I never really felt hampered by the controls in that sense. Another thing that I also really liked about the shooting is how the damage you do increases as you chain successful hits together. In fact, I might go as far as to say that it's probably the best thing about this game, as it actually makes a simple and repetitive as fuck gameplay somewhat kinesthetically pleasing. What also adds to this is that your performance affects your score and ranking at the end of each level, and how both of those actually translate to EXP. And to make things even marginally better, you also get to choose whether or not you want to exchange the EXP for Gil. Choosing EXP will make Vincent stronger and give him more HP, but choosing Gil could fetch you some fancy weapon upgrades. So you kinda get to choose whether or not you want to rely on brute force or just your own skill. It isn't much, but at least it adds some incentive to try and play better. Despite all of that though, it seems that regardless of the few things I do actually like about this game, there's always something there that seems to drag it down. And I tried coming up with a decent explanation of what I exactly mean when I say that. So here goes. Dirge isn't necessarily bad. It's not broken or anything like that. No. The big problem is that for all the good, there's just too much mediocre and bland things that outweigh it. For instance, there's a couple of good atmospheric songs in the soundtrack, but also a shit ton of soulless action movie music. Which is functional, but I am an autist! And I don't give a flying fuck about functionality. I just wanted to tingle my brain bits. And while the character models do look great, and the animation is done fairly well, the backgrounds and level designs are just extremely boring and simple. I mean, there's this giant cyberpunk city called Edge, which is a pretty cool location, but most of the game takes place in canyons, sewers, and office buildings. And outside of a few hiccups, the voice acting isn't actually all that bad, but the story and most of the dialogue end up feeling very half-assed and haphazardly thrown together. Not to mention that the plot spins completely out of control near the end, which almost feel like they just made up some random shit as they rode along instead of thinking ahead. It's one of those games that's easy to like when you're a kid, or just plain stupid. But as an adult, it's hard to look past all of its faults. I kind of found that the only few reasons of why I felt that I actually liked it are just the tiny bits of Final Fantasy VII still shining through the vomit. But the more I look at it, it just seems to me that all the things that this game introduces itself just seem to fall flat completely. Really, it's almost kinda bizarre to see a game with so many well-made big-budget elements to it fall completely flat because of something that seems more like a lack of vision to me than anything else. If only they'd just spend more time fine-tuning it and stealing ideas from Devil May Cry and Resi 4. Also, while I do actually like the game's plot, it's kinda hard for me to deny how much of a mess it ends up being, despite it not actually starting out all that bad. I could try and rewrite what I said about a year ago, but I actually feel like I didn't do too bad of a job back then. So excuse the spoilers, the poor mic quality, and the fact that it might seem a bit out of context to someone who hasn't played the game, but I feel that this pretty much explains my main problem with the game's story.
Now what makes this game so silly is the fact that it's absolutely convinced that it's awesome. It has this serious, dark, gritty undertone of badassery, but it's just executed very poorly. New story elements get tossed in way too haphazardly and the action goes from normal shooty shoot to holy shit, the world is exploding. It makes no sense no matter how much it tries to convince you that it does. Failed Shinra experiments wanting revenge? Okay, sure, I can buy that. But Hojo making a digital copy of himself, laying dormant in cyberspace for years and then taking over Weiss's body? No. Just no. It basically breaks the rules of the world it's set in. It's like having zombies in the upcoming Star Wars movie. It might seem sort of cool on paper, but there's no way you can pull that off and stay serious about that at the same time. The game just tries so much, but does so very little. And that to me is hilarious. Ha ha! Dirge of Cerberus isn't bad. It's just silly.